Is God a moral decision?
God is the spirit that guides you when you make the proper moral decisions. So I wouldn't say God is a moral decision. He's the spirit of moral decision. That's actually not a bad definition. Like, part of what I'm trying to do with this book is to point out that a lot of what's happening in the biblical corpus is actually definitional, right? Well, modern people think the fundamental issue is, do you believe in God? But that's not the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is, what do you mean by God? And so let me give you an example of this that will make it clearer. So there's a medieval idea that God is the summum bonum, which means the sum of all that's good. Is to point out that a lot of what's happening in the biblical corpus is actually definitional, right? Well, modern people think the fundamental issue is, do you believe in God? But that's not the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is, what do you mean by God? Clearer. So there's a medieval idea that God is the summum bonum, which means the sum of all that's good, or the essence of all that's good. Okay, you might say, well, I don't believe in that. Now remember, this is a definition of God, right? God is the sum of all that's good. Okay, all right, so you don't believe in that. All right, let's take that apart. Do you believe that some things are better than other things? Well, people will say yes. Okay, so then you believe that there is a scale of good. Okay, is there something that all things that are good share in common? To act means to do something that's better than what you're doing now, right? There's no action without movement towards the good. And well, you might say, well, I don't believe that there's a unitary good. Okay, you believe there's a fractionated good. Well, then what do you do when those things oppose one another, right? Which would be in a conflict of duty. What do you refer to to help you adjudicate between different goods? Well, generally what you do is, if you could pursue A, which is good, or B, which is good, and they conflict, then you pick the higher good. Okay, do you believe in a higher good? Well, if you don't, you can't decide between goods, which means you're paralyzed. If you do believe in the higher good, then do you believe in the highest good? Well, the highest good is God. What do you mean by that? By definition. Okay, so now you have a definition. Now, then the next question might be, well, what's your relationship with the highest good? And you might say, well, I don't have a relationship. It's like, well, actually you do, because you act in relationship to it. You can't help it. One of the interesting things about the biblical corpus is that it's based on the insistence that you have a relationship with being and becoming, a relationship, like a personal relationship.
When you say
the Bible is actually the first library of books. It's written by a very large number of different people and aggregated over thousands of years, and then sequenced into a narrative, interestingly enough, because no one really sequenced it. Or by no one, I mean no individual person. It was the endeavor of the collective, or the spirit that possessed the collective over thousands of years. But the narrative is coherent, which is really quite something. And so the narrative is an investigation, number one, into the nature of God, number two, into the nature of relationship with God, and then number three, into the nature of the proper relationship with God, all of those things. And God is the sum of all that's good. So the Bible is an analysis of the human relationship with the good. I think we're at the beginning of the counter-enlightenment. The propositions, the Enlightenment view of man is wrong. And this, out of the Enlightenment view came science. But the science now indicates that the Enlightenment view of man is wrong.
What do you mean?
Well, the Enlightenment types believed that we could orient ourselves in the world, let's say empirically, and this is Sam Harris's proposition, you can abide by the facts. You can orient yourself as a consequence of the dispassionate analysis of the facts. You can't. And the neuroscientists have figured that out. So it's not just the evidence that that view is necessarily incorrect, is overwhelming and multidimensional. You can't orient yourself by the facts. Why? Because there are as many facts as there are things. In fact, if you combine things, the nature of the combination is also a fact. So there's as many facts as there are things and combinations of things. Well, you can't orient yourself by that. You drown in chaos. It's like you're standing in the desert and there's an infinite number of directions you could go. Well, how do you choose a direction?
And that's showing up in that most recent survey that I just mentioned. People feeling meaninglessness, purposelessness.
Right.
I'm
lost.
overwhelmed
They're lost
by...
in the desert.
Yep.
They're lost in the desert. And the desert is the desert of facts. It's dead facts.
Especially given how few people can agree on, is this a fact or is this counterfact?